Hello and welcome to another really, really, really exciting episode of the Fully Charged Show podcast. We have focused a lot in the time we've been doing this on the development of electric vehicles in Europe, in the United States, in even Australia, China, South Korea. Lots and lots of different places, Japan. So loads of different places. I'm not going to be remembering other places we've talked about. But quite specifically, we've done next to zero about India. And I really wanted to rectify that because what is happening in India is noticeable. It's having an impact on the global stage. And I just thought it was really important to try and find someone in India. And I found this extraordinary woman, and I'm going to say her name correctly now, Chaitanya Kanuri, who works for the WRI India, which is the World Resources Institute. And so she studies how cities operate, how they can be changed, and in particular, thankfully, the ground transport systems and how they are changing and adapting. And just one little figure just before we start. Today in India, there will be around 5,700 electric vehicle sales per day. 365 days a year. That's the kind of change that we're seeing in India. And what we're talking about when I say electric vehicles is generally 2 and 3 wheelers. That's the vast majority of ground transport that people use as opposed to public transport, as in buses and trucks and things. That's the vast majority of what is being taken up. And it has had an impact. So not just India on its own, but India, Southeast Asia, China. The explosion in 2 and 3 wheeled electric vehicles has resulted in. So we're looking at now a total global fleet in terms of electric vehicles of over 400 million vehicles. And that has had an impact on fuel sales, on liquid fuel sales of 1% globally. A 1% reduction that's not to do with a pandemic or a war or social disruption or anything else. It's to do with demand drop. The demand drop is of that scale. So 1%, you think that's tiny. That is hundreds of billions of barrels of oil that aren't being burnt. So there is the scintilla of a change coming towards us, which is, I think, fascinating, challenging, exciting. Please do tell your friends to subscribe to the Fully Charged Show podcast because of the kind of quality of guests we're getting on this show is phenomenal. And we've got lots of exciting new ideas for the podcast coming up in the next year, really. Please tell your friends about it as well. And please, now, I won't say any more because this conversation I'm sure you will find is fascinating. Please welcome to the Fully Charged Show podcast, Chaitanya Kanuri. This episode of the Fully Charged podcast is brought to you by OVO's Charge Anywhere. Charge Anywhere helps you power your car wherever you are, plan your route and pay. You'll have access to over 34,000 chargers across the UK's largest charging networks and more than 400,000 chargers across Europe. Setup is easy. Just download the OVO Charge app, create your account, add payment details, hit the road and start charging. There's no need to be an OVO customer either. Simply pay as you go or benefit from up to 15% off your charging with monthly boost packages. OVO's Charge Anywhere. Power your next journey with peace of mind. So this has been a long time coming for me. I've wanted to do this for a long time, Chaitanya, but thank you so much for taking time today to talk to us because I think this is an area we've neglected in our show pretty much completely. We've covered some Indian-built electric vehicles over the years that have come to this country. I've talked to some Indian engineers, I think, over the years, but really we've skimmed the surface of what is, well, I've just looked it up. the fourth largest economy in the world, and the third largest greenhouse gas emitter, and the fourth largest electricity consumer. Yeah. So that's India in a nutshell.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Forget the thousands of years of culture, the British Raj. Forget all that. That's what's happening now. But it's just recently I started seeing more and more stories about how many electric vehicles there are in the world, and then when you break it down, you go, "Oh, there's not many cars, but my goodness, there's a lot of bikes, mopeds, 3-wheelers." E-rickshaws, all that stuff. So and I don't know how I came across you, but I'm so glad I did. You're the person I want to talk to you about this. But can you, after my ludicrously unfocused waffle, can you just give us a quick breakdown of your story and what you're doing now and how you got there? I think that really does help, because the WRI is a fascinating organization. But can you explain all those bits?
Sure, sure. So yeah, I'm Chaitanya. I am a urban policy analyst by training many years ago, and as such, I have since in the past 10 years sort of moved towards the transport sector, and I was working in sustainable transport for about 3 4 years after my master's, and then I started getting into electric mobility. I mean, around 2018 19, that was where India was heading in terms of its transport systems. And India was also looking at strengthening their sustainable development goals and starting to think about their climate mitigation pathways. And electric mobility came up as one of the key pathways for the transport sector, which again, in a developing country like India, is actually very fast growing in terms of emissions, in terms of just transport demand, both for passenger and goods vehicles. And so, given the increase in demand and its and how important it is for economic growth, how do you still ensure that you're decoupling this economic growth from the climate and environmental impacts? And so, therefore, transport electric mobility was one of those pathways that was established as one of India's pathways for decarbonizing their transport system.
Right.
So I was with WRI India at that time, and we went into it in a deep way. And since then, we've been working with national governments, state governments to actually start working on supporting them to start accelerating their transport electrification.
Right. And I mean, that, so the WRI is the World Research Institute.
World Resources Institute.
Resources. Sorry, World Resources Institute, which is a global organization. I mean, there are different departments all around the world, but specifically you are WRI India. So
Yeah,
that's the and that so that's where that's your effectively your day job is working with them.
absolutely. And I mean, yeah, so WRI is global, but several country offices also function completely independently in country.
Right.
So WRI India is completely Indian and it is a registered organization. We work closely with our global counterparts to exchange best practices and to bring any knowledge exchange and all as may be needed. But we work very closely with the local stakeholders in India at the state and national levels, like I was saying.
Right. And I mean, one of the things that I think is probably important to think about for our listeners is I think we're relatively protected from the more extremes of climate change that we're experiencing around the world in this country. We're a damp island in the edge of the Atlantic. Although we've had, in the last couple of years, the hottest 2 days we've ever had in this country ever in its history. So it's not that it's not here. We are definitely experiencing, but I get a fairly strong feeling that there are quite dramatic, noticeable shifts in climate, and particularly for high temperatures in India. Is that something that is kind of the general public are going, hang on a minute, it's hotter than it was when I was a kid?
Definitely. I
Right.
think so. I think both in terms of temperature and the predictability of the monsoon.
Yeah.
Monsoon becomes vital for agriculture, which again is a very important sector for India's economy, and the number of people and households that are dependent on it as well is
Yeah.
significantly higher than, say, in Western nations. And so the fact that the monsoon isn't as predictable, its patterns are changing, and so you can't really look at rain-fed agriculture, which still is large parts of the country. That's one. And there's also, of course, the air pollution issue
Yeah.
in all Indian cities. A lot of Indian cities are actually at the top of the list in terms of the most polluted when it comes to air pollution in the world. And so that
Right.
is definitely something that everyone is noticing. It is impact, like people are literally voting with their feet. I've heard of many colleagues who have either chosen to move out of Delhi which is probably like one of the worst impacted by
Right.
poor air quality. So it is impacting lives. People are definitely, I think, cognizant of that, and yeah, I think climate change is definitely something in the minds of most educated Indians, and those who
Right.
have livelihoods. Like others,
Yeah.
they're probably more like poverty issues and all for them to
Sure.
focus on. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, that is, I mean, it's intriguing that that's a kind of driving force. It feels like, and I mean, I'm saying this from what I've observed very casually from outside and what I've read, but that's a quite a strong driving force. You know, that if you're a relatively poor person that lives in a big city and you can use an old two-stroke motorbike, which leaves a trail of smoke,
yeah,
or you can use an electric scooter. You know, if you have the ability to do that, the difference and the improvement in your life is pretty instant and noticeable.
yeah, yeah. No,
Yeah,
definitely. And but the question is, do they have the means to make
yeah,
that shift? A lot of times,
yeah,
it is necessity because of which sort of they're running these very old vehicles on the
yeah.
roads.
But I mean, what we have seen though is a really large increase. I mean, have you got some figures of the kind of numbers of electric vehicles on the roads now in
Yeah.
the broadest
um,
sense of the term?
I
Is
mean, yeah,
it's
I sort of looked those up in preparation for this because
yes,
these numbers are changing so rapidly
right,
month on month. So I think as of uh, financial year 2024, which ends in March 2024, in India, we have about 4 million EVs registered overall over the
right,
past 2 years. And just in the last 1 year, we had about 1.7 million EVs that were registered. And
wow, in
55,
1 year, wow,
yeah, in just 1 year, so
right.
1.7 million. But then again, we do have about 25 million vehicles being registered every year.
Right. Okay. But it's actually that's still quite a big
Yeah,
chunk though.
yeah.
That's a
So
it's
so
a
we
much
went
bigger than
over
here. Yeah.
exactly. We went over 5%. I think we were somewhere close to 6 or 7% in the last year. So it is
Right.
definitely moving from very, very early adopters and enthusiasts to becoming a little more mainstream,
Right.
for sure. And that growth is primarily being driven by two-wheelers and three-wheelers. So you
Right.
have about 55% of that 1.7 million is two-wheelers, and another 35% is three-wheelers. So like
Right.
90% of the total EV registrations in the past year were two-wheelers and three-wheelers.
Right. And that is, I mean, that is just mind-boggling because it is also the thing that immediately springs to mind is how do you charge them all? That's I mean, it's only because I have spent a limited amount of time in Mumbai, so I've sort of seen the streets, and you go, even at that time when I was there, I was thinking, how would you charge a car here? Just
Yeah.
to an outsider, it looks like it's just overwhelming, but wonderful. I don't mean that as a criticism. I absolutely loved it. But I mean, is there now provision for charging? And I mean, presumably, many people can charge at their homes, but I'm sure many can't in cities.
Yeah. So again, it depends on the vehicle segments we're talking about. And if we're talking about two-wheelers and three-wheelers, two-wheelers primarily are charged at home today,
Right,
because most people do have that facility, whoever is purchasing them right now. Again,
right,
you have to divide these segments further because there's a segment of two-wheelers that are being purchased and designed for commercial purposes, for delivery purposes, given that
right.
the number of hyperlocal deliveries and all are growing because of your fast commerce and all of that that's
Yeah,
happening, which is also happening in Indian cities. There's a lot more like food delivery, grocery delivery, all of that on demand happening within your houses. So there's a lot more of the delivery demand coming up. And so because EVs were also coming up at that time, a lot of electric two-wheelers were designed for delivery. So that's like
right.
a completely different model that's only sold for commercial purposes. And then
Yeah,
you of course have your personal two-wheelers for anyone who's going to be using it for personal mobility.
yeah,
So for the latter, the ones that are like more personal vehicles, I don't think there's a major charging problem because people charge at home.
right.
And today what's primarily happening is they set up either like just a 3.3 kilowatt regular 3-pin plug connection,
Right.
or an industrial version of that socket connection in order to charge their two-wheeler, because these are relatively small batteries, right? Like 2 kilowatt
Yeah.
hour to 4 kilowatt hour. So that's not a problem, and you don't really even need to increase the connected load of your household connection typically, because they
Yeah.
just sort of connect it to your meter,
Yeah.
even in an apartment. So that's not a problem. Um, for three-wheelers and for commercial vehicles, what we've seen is charging hubs sort of popping up.
Right.
And this is especially prevalent in the case of e-rickshaws. And we will need to go into e-rickshaws just so
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
so that we can explain what they are, what kind of beast they are.
Yeah.
But for those, like you have these like large charging yards in a way where people can park and charge their vehicles overnight, because
Right.
again, a lot of the drivers are lower income folks who may not have access to parking near their homes as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's very actually. I'm trying to. I'm saving up for the e-rickshaws because they're so fascinating. I mean, the one of the figures I have is that this year there's around 5,700 EVs, so mainly scooters and three wheelers, sold every day, which is, I mean, in India, which is, the actual figures are mind boggling. I mean, they
Yeah,
really are.
yeah.
So, and now, I mean, an important part of that is where are those vehicles made? I mean, are they mainly made in India? Is that the main source of them?
Yeah, I mean, so actually, every model of two-wheeler and three-wheeler that is sold in India is made in India.
Right.
Um,
Wow.
but like it's either, again, there's different levels of indigenization or localization, as you would call it, in the supply chain. So actually one of so the Indian government has been very sort of bullish on trying to make manufacturing localized and bringing more
Right.
value addition to the manufacturing industry in India. So even the incentive schemes that were designed for EVs. So there's a very big scheme called FAME, the faster adoption
Yeah.
of, it's a mouthful, faster adoption and manufacturing of electric and hybrid vehicle scheme. They
Yeah.
do also pop off a few words in there to make it nice and
Yeah.
pithy, fame, right? But like the first version of that scheme came out in 2015, and the second version, which was a relatively smaller amount, and the
Right.
second version came out in 2019, and that was 10,000 crores. And I have looked at what Indian rupees 10,000 crores, and I had also done the math on
All right.
what that was. That is about 900 million pounds. Okay.
Oh,
Um,
right. A lot of money. Okay.
so
Yeah.
this was a scheme for financial incentives,
Right.
upfront purchase incentives for electric vehicles and for charging infrastructure,
Right.
which was applicable from 2019 to 2024. So it just sort of ended very recently. And one of the prerequisites of being eligible to get the incentive was that that vehicle had to have at least 50% local components, locally manufactured components.
Right.
So that way there is a push where anything that is trying to be incentivized or prioritized does have to have very strong local manufacturing linkages. But then of
Right.
course the batteries, the motors are still at least cells are imported today. Maybe the sort of chips and semiconductors for the motors are imported today, even if
Right.
not the whole battery pack. So there's a lot of local pack assembly happening, but not cell assembly.
Right.
So yes, well,
Yeah.
and then again, certain vehicle segments, though especially the lower cost vehicle options among them, are almost wholesale imported and assembled.
Right. I see.
So you
Yeah.
have a wide variation, but I would say the majority of vehicles are all made in India, and like most of the good OEMs are manufacturing in India, and
Right.
like with a large part of local components.
But I mean, I mean, we've got to go on to e-rickshaws because I've found a couple of articles in Indian newspapers about local companies that have kind of are building e-rickshaws very much because the big OEMs generally don't. I mean, it seems to be it's smaller manufacturers that make those. So can you just for the complete ignoramus Can you explain what a rickshaw is? Because I mean, I had a ride in one in Mumbai, and I think the gentleman who was incredibly fit was pedaling. It wasn't electrically assisted. It was an old. It looked like an old one.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
there are now.
That was a cycle rickshaw, right? I
Yes,
assume. Yeah.
yeah. So that's a cycle rickshaw. So have there been there yeah motorized rickshaws, i.e., with a combustion engine, which is I did see lots of those.
So, I mean, just before getting into e-rickshaws, I also want
Yeah,
to say that the EV ecosystem kind of did provide the opportunity for a lot of new companies to come up,
right.
new local companies to come up. It's not just in the e-rickshaw space, but also the like more formalized cargo three-wheeler space, and in
Right.
the two-wheeler space, there are a bunch of companies today that actually are in the top sales of these segments, and they are startups. I mean, they were
Right.
essentially startups. So,
Wow.
I mean, that was another, I think, interesting element of the EV transition that sort of just, I mean, it's still a very nascent transition, but it gave the opportunity to really shake up the auto market, which is typically like governed by these big
Yeah.
legacy OEMs that have been around forever, right?
Yeah.
And in the car space, I would say that still holds. It's still the bigger guys that are making the transition and keeping the
Right.
market, but two-wheeler, three-wheeler, even I mean in the bus space, for example, you've got a lot of new companies coming. So
Oh, right. Oh,
yeah,
right.
so in two-wheeler, so given that we're focusing on two-wheelers and three-wheelers, and two-wheelers, you have like Ola Electric, Aether Energy, which are again like which were sort of pioneering the ecosystem, and
Right.
they started releasing or launching EVs before the legacy guys kind of got on board, and they're like, oh wait, this is going to be a thing, so we should
Right.
put out our own models.
Yeah.
So they were a bit laggard, but now they're of course catching up, and they're in the top
Yeah.
market segment players right now. But yeah,
Right.
so just yeah, wanted to emphasize that local companies, new ones coming up, is not an e-rickshaw phenomenon only, but just we have
Right.
seen it across multiple segments.
Yeah. Which is, I mean, that's great for the Indian economy, and I mean that you're making those
Yeah,
at, in your own country is really important.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and they all have grand export ambitions as well, and we are
Right.
starting to see some movement on that. So we'll see where that goes. I would say it's still very early days for that, but they are
Right.
all seeing this as an opportunity. Um, Coming to e-rickshaws. Uh,
Yes.
okay, so So the reason it becomes important to distinguish it, what e-rickshaws are, is because we keep hearing about how the three-wheeler market in India is like electrifying rapidly, and it is. Like
Right.
if you
Yeah.
see of the total three-wheeler sales in the last year, about I think 55% were electric.
Right.
So
Wow.
so
Okay.
like the three-wheeler segment is one that is 50+% electrified already,
Right.
compared to 6% of or 7% of the overall EV ecosystem. Or
Right.
even when you look at two-wheelers, it's just about 5% today, because even though they're big in number, it's just that 70% of the country is two-wheelers.
Yes.
So it'll take time to sort of for that to, I think, penetrate deeper and faster. But in three-wheelers, we've seen this sort of rapid shift, and that was largely because of e-rickshaws. And
Right.
e-rickshaws are what I would call a native electric or born electric vehicle segment. They are not the tuk-tuks that you had before,
Yeah.
like the ones that are popularized, that are your ICE, internal combustion engine three-wheeler vehicles that ferried passengers.
Yeah.
They are not that. They are actually an electrified motorized alternative for the cycle rickshaws. So
Okay. All right.
around 2010, when Delhi was hosting the Commonwealth Games, they wanted to provide a low emission, low cost mode of transport for visitors, to also show that they were looking at, the climate and
Yeah.
sustainability. And that is when e-rickshaws were introduced. And now they've become this option for any, rather than cycle rickshaws being the lowest cost form of shared mobility, that is now being taken over by e-rickshaws.
Right.
How they're different is that they are lower powered and they have lower speeds. And so like they're like 25 kilometers per hour is the maximum they can go at.
Yeah.
And they have smaller motors basically. And a lot of them, I think about 90%, are lead acid battery driven.
Right. Wow.
So
Okay.
that they're not lithium ion battery. And so
Yeah.
that just makes them like, I think, half the cost of a typical electrified tuk tuk.
Right.
Um, I mean, they're called. Going to call them e-rickshaws and auto rickshaws. It's similar,
Right.
but
So,
but
so just
e-rickshaws
quickly,
are about
so just
half.
quickly, there are electric versions of what I would recognise as a tuk tuk
Yes, yes,
now, right? But
yes.
that's a different
That's a
sector.
different segment.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you look at the motor vehicle rules, e-rickshaws are classified as L3 vehicles, and the auto rickshaws are classified as L5 vehicles.
Right.
And then, yeah, so that's the distinction from a sort of technical point of view. And then specifications wise, of course, like I was saying, different battery chemistries, lower power. They're supposed to have lower motor power. Also, their motor power is also capped, etc. Um, and so, yeah, they just end up being much, much more affordable for drivers. And they also, since they can maximum go at 25 kilometers per hour, and they're very sort of lightweight vehicles without much suspension or anything. So
Right.
they're not necessarily very comfortable for going over long distances.
No.
So actually, they've been increasingly used as a form of last mile or short haul mobility in cities. And they've exploded basically, uh,
Right.
just because they're affordable. They're an easy entry point into livelihoods for a lot of unemployed youth that are coming from rural areas to cities to make a living. A
Yeah.
lot of people invested in them and then rent them out to drivers who then drive them and make their livelihood. Uh, because of all these reasons, I think just last year again, about 500,000 e-rickshaws were registered.
Wow.
Um,
Wow.
yeah, and the other important thing about e-rickshaws is they started before regulations could catch up with them. They were
Right.
like they were introduced on roads, and then in 2015 their definition was inserted into the Motor Vehicle Act and motor vehicle rules, and like
Right.
their certification processes came up around that time. So you have
Right.
a large informal segment in this sector. So
Yeah.
a lot, I think about 70% of them are not registered. That
Wow.
number that gets registered is growing year on year, thankfully, because governments are also taking note and sort of pushing people to register vehicles and only buy certified vehicles.
Right.
But for example, you have like some 450 manufacturers of e-rickshaws, a large number of whom
Wow.
are just assemblers. Like
Yeah.
they import kits and they just assemble them and then they sell them. And so they may
Right.
not even be certified. And if they're not certified, of course, they can't get registered, right?
Right.
So there is that issue as well with the sector, despite its incredible affordableness and its impacts like on affordability for consumers as well.
Yeah.
So they're like half the cost of an auto rickshaw if you want to like take a 2 kilometer trip for a
Right.
consumer.
That is a big. That's
Yeah, yeah,
huge, isn't it? Yeah. So they're much cheaper to hire as a passenger. Yeah.
exactly. And I mean, so basically, it's sort of seen as a homegrown innovation which exploded organically without much incentive support, frankly.
Yeah.
Um, But now there is an increasing recognition that there actually is an oversupply in many cities. And so, how do you
Right.
start curbing those? Because so far, there were no permit caps on how many need to be there,
Right.
like there were in the auto rickshaw segment. The auto rickshaw segment was always heavily regulated.
Right.
And by sort of contrast, e-rickshaws sort of just kind of did some ninja like
Yes.
growth without really being observed. And then by the time people sort of started taking stock, it's like, okay, now let's do something about this.
Yeah, because I mean, presumably you could reach a point where a street is so jammed full of e-rickshaws you can't go anywhere anyway. I mean,
And I think there are examples of those streets in some cities for sure.
but I mean, that's a really fascinating way that effectively a new technology has an enormous impact. That it's got nothing to do with government regulation or incentives or encouraging. It's just gone. Oh, this stuff works.
Yeah,
I'll
yeah,
use it.
yeah.
It's as simple as that. I mean, that's why in a way it's a fascinating
It
sector.
is, it is, and it speaks to it like there's this word in it's called Jugaad, which is called Frugal Innovation. Basically,
Right.
it's seen as a very Indian thing that you sort of
Yeah.
manage, make do, engineer, and sort of make it work. And I
Yeah.
mean, I think like e-rickshaws have been presented as a big example of that. And even today, you see variants where it's like, okay, this road is too narrow for a typical e-rickshaw. I'm gonna make one that's narrower body. I'm gonna sort of
Right. That
rejig
will
it.
fit there.
Yeah, yeah. So like you see these sort of very localized solutions coming up, and so
Right.
there's that flexibility as well. So yes, this is
Yes.
definitely an example of that.
But I mean, that had a, I mean, that has had, in certain circles, I mean, that approach has had an enormous impact in this country. I mean, I was very aware, even as a very young man, of it was often described as low impact technology, but it was all rickshaw based. It was from India. It was
Yeah.
from, I think, basically English hippies who went to India in the 1960s and 70s and went, "Wow, man, far out! I want to, I want a rickshaw." And so in Oxford, there was a group of people who were trying to say, "Let's not have cars in city. Let's use something that And that's the first time I rode a rickshaw. I pedalled it was in Oxford in about 1975. So
No,
that's
no. Okay, yeah.
that's a bit of personal history there. But I mean, it is the I mean, it is the kind of that attitude. I think is just wonderful, and it's kind of what the whole world should do, but we're not, because we want really flash, high end big SUVs. I mean, is there? Because I know I don't want to lock in entirely to two and three wheels, although that's obviously. But I mean, is there an increase in not necessarily luxury vehicles, but in electric cars? Is there a noticeable increase in numbers? Because I don't remember seeing any when I was in Mumbai, which is probably
Oh yeah.
8 years
No,
ago.
you wouldn't have seen. You said 2018 or something, right?
Yeah, I think it was even before that, maybe 2016. I can't quite
Yeah,
remember when
no,
it
you
was.
wouldn't have
Yeah,
seen any then because I think the car market's also developed a lot actually.
right.
There like previous like there was a first generation of electric cars which were again homegrown but had like low powered they had low voltage batteries which was basically
Yeah,
unheard of, right? Like they were really compact small cars
yeah,
with low voltage batteries which were primarily used for taxi purposes.
right.
And today you have you have a lot more models, definitely not as many as you do in the two-wheeler space. For example,
Right,
there's still one of the key barriers to more electric adoption in the four car space is actually that there are not necessarily enough models because like cars are segmented quite a bit, right? Like
right.
SUVs and sedans and
Yeah,
compact sedans and hatchbacks and everything. And so like mass market cars, um, cheaper cars for the affordable end of the market are still kind of not there as not there aren't as many as there should be.
right.
But there are a lot of luxury cars, and unfortunately, India is also seeing that trend of a lot of SUVs coming into the market.
Yeah,
Unfortunate for us sustainable transport folks, of course.
yes.
Everyone else is like, why? What's unfortunate about that? They're
Yeah,
great.
they're really cool. I want
My
one.
family
Yeah,
loves them. Everyone loves them, right? But just their like fuel inefficiency and the amount of
yeah,
road space they take up. But yeah, I mean, again, because India has so many contrasts, you have like a very sizable upper middle class population
yeah,
that actually is a huge market for these big luxury brands as well.
right.
Similar to how you see China, you have all the luxury brands that exist in China as well because
Yeah,
there's such a huge market, even though it's maybe only 10% of the population.
yeah.
I think
It's a
India,
big population. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. So India's the same, and you do see a lot of luxury car brands and all coming in that are just targeting that market, and you see a lot of luxury vehicles now, and a lot of EVs as well. I would say there are a couple of companies that are doing a lot of in good stuff in the e4-wheeler space. One is this company called Blue Smart, which is doing electric taxis. So it was again
right,
a new fleet, a new company that came up with the electric vehicle boom. So it wasn't an
right,
Uber, which was sort of pre-existing, and so it was aggregating cars. But they were like, okay, we'll do taxi services, but we will not have them be owned by the drivers. We will employ the drivers,
Right.
and we will run taxi services in a slightly more old-fashioned way. Maybe we look at different sort of procurement models. We do leases. We do different sorts of those.
Yeah.
But so they've also been doing some interesting stuff, and they've been growing in multiple cities. And there's again a lot of companies that are running only electric fleets for deliveries and everything. So yeah,
Right.
you do see a
So
lot
it's a
happening.
growing sector. And also you did mention buses, because I mean that's a critically important area that in all cities. I mean, thankfully, we actually can say we have a lot of electric buses on our roads in the UK, finally. But,
Yeah.
and I think what's interesting with that is often people, even who ride on them, I mean, why should they be interested? But they're not interested, but they don't know. I've talked to a lovely lady on a bus in London, and I said, "Do you know this is an electric bus?" And she went, "Oh, is it?" She said, "I use it every day."
Uh,
She hadn't noticed.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's how it should be, right? Like there
Yeah,
is
in a way
no
it should. Yeah,
difference in performance. There is no difference in like
yeah,
your quality of ride. If anything, it would be an improvement because
yeah,
they are replacing aged fleets.
yes,
But yes, there are a lot of buses, and the e-bus story in India is also yes something quite encouraging. The government has also supported that very strongly through the FAME schemes and through other schemes. So actually, we started with a like relatively modest allocation during the FAME scheme, but since then the government has set a target, which they're actually working towards quite actively, of getting to 50,000 electric buses by 2030.
wow,
Um,
okay,
and and it's so government driven right now because these are all the public bus systems that are electrifying first. It's
yeah,
not your private bus operators today.
right,
Again, because there are a lot of still financial issues and all that still need to be figured out in the bus
yeah,
space, like who is fronting that level of finance for bus fleets, right?
yeah,
And a lot of private fleet operators own like small numbers of buses, 1 to 5 buses. So how are they going to get good rates? How are they going to get so like a lot of it is still happening contractually, like where the public bus companies give an order and then the buses start rolling out. But
right,
still, all of that aside, I think I don't know the exact number for buses, but we have 5,000 plus buses in the country. And there's one city, particularly Delhi, which actually has about 1,900 or 2,000 buses at this point.
right,
So that's significant. And again, Delhi's been one of the most aggressive states on the electrification agenda because they do see it as one of the solutions for the air quality issue.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but yeah, and so I think and what's interesting is the electric buses are also sort of rejuvenating the interest in public transport
right. Wow, that's
by the
very
government,
encouraging.
which is
Yeah,
which is great because like maybe in the decade before this one, a lot of the focus, and it continues even today, a lot of the focus had started on metros because like
right,
Calcutta was one city which had a metro system since forever. But other than
yeah,
that, like the first metro rail that came up was in like 2002, 2003 in Delhi, in India.
right,
And then since then, you've got like 10 to 15 cities with metro systems. And so a lot of investments were going into the metros.
right,
And I mean, during that period, buses were not necessarily neglected, but the mode share of buses was dropping. More people were shifting to private transport, private vehicles. So
yeah,
there were multiple forces at play, growing incomes and people also wanting to own a vehicle and all of that. But India actually had really healthy public transport mode shares, Indian cities, and those have been declining, which is a concern given that our cities are very dense, are very congested, and should sort of be having the majority of their transport be public transport, like you
yeah,
see some of these Southeast Asian cities and all doing.
yeah,
And so this renewed interest in buses is very encouraging, and now the government is also trying to say that if we're bringing in new buses, let them be electric,
right,
and we'll figure out how to make that happen. So that's
yeah,
great as well. And they have a current scheme where they're trying to get e-buses into 170 cities, some of which previously never even had public transport systems. So that's
right,
great.
yeah. I mean yes, that's a wonderful thought that in a sense there are cities that will have skipped the negativity of having internal combustion engines. That it's slightly unrealistic, but there is an element where if your first bus in your city is electric, you've kind of you've lucked out. I mean, that's really good.
Yeah.
One of the things that I wanted to mention, because I know our viewers and listeners will be interested in, is battery swapping, because I think we've seen quite a lot of that reported, which is mainly, I think, Southeast Asia, as you mentioned, and in China there are very big schemes like that. But it does exist in India to a certain extent.
It does exist in India to a certain
Right.
extent. It is largely prevalent in two-wheelers and three-wheelers. It was
Yeah.
experimented with for buses, like one bus agency in West India actually did try it, but I
Oh,
think,
right.
I mean, they were piloting it to understand whether that's more viable as a model or, just contracting bus services to a private operator is more viable. So they were
Right.
testing two or three models of what sort of electric bus business model would make sense. So it was tested there, but today it is largely prevalent for two and three wheelers. It is largely only in like three or four metropolitan cities, I would say, like
Right.
largely concentrated. And that's for a couple of reasons. So battery swapping is great in principle, and because you're sort of taking the upfront cost of the battery out of the vehicle, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
especially for commercial vehicles, that makes a lot of sense because, again, it lowers that entry barrier for lower income people that are looking for vehicles for livelihood purposes to
Yeah.
actually purchase them. And those are the ones that have the highest utilization on roads as well.
Right.
So for fleet operators or self owner drivers, for all of them, it just makes more sense if the vehicle cost comes down. Uh, but today, battery swapping systems are kind of what you would call closed loop systems. So you have the battery swap operator, and he makes partnerships with various OEMs, vehicle OEMs, saying
Right.
that you use this model of battery in your vehicle, and I will set up the battery swapping stations for you.
Right.
There are no universal standards basically. So it's not like anyone can enter and start battery swapping using the same standardized brick battery, and then it's not like anyone who's driving a battery swap vehicle can stop at any swapping station and swap their batteries. It would have to be that of that specific brand.
Yeah.
And so that still does make sense for a lot of these commercial vehicle models. So you do have a lot of commercial vehicle operators that are using battery swapping, but as a result of this sort of limitation, it's not scaled up as much as it could.
Yeah.
And the general consensus, at least, is that battery swapping for four wheelers, like you're seeing in China, may not may not be something that takes off too much in India because those are very cost capital intensive.
Yeah.
Like
Hugely
just setting
expensive.
up,
Yeah.
yeah, that whole mechanical swapping infrastructure just really adds to the cost, and it adds to the space requirement.
Right.
One of the advantages of battery swapping today is that a lot of them are setting up in existing fuel stations.
Right.
So like they just need one corner and a space for two, three vehicles to line up, and it just
Yeah.
gets done in 2 minutes, right? So that's its advantage for sure. So, but again, as faster charging keeps coming into the market and all, we do think it's probably going to be largely for commercial vehicles and smaller commercial vehicles. But yeah, so it is happening maybe in Bangalore, maybe in Delhi, and it's also happening interestingly for e-rickshaws, where after their first lead acid battery gets sort of finished, used, retired, which happens in about 12 to 18 months
Yeah. They
for
don't
lead
last
acid
very
batteries, they don't last very long. And especially if you don't maintain them well, because you're supposed to sort of like refill the water and all of that, then they can get like destroyed in like 9 months. And that's been a
long. Right.
complaint. But once that after that first battery life is done, what some e-rickshaw operators are doing in cities like Delhi is battery swap guys are going to them, they're retrofitting their vehicle for an
Right.
LIB battery, a lithium-ion battery, and then those e-rickshaws become lithium-ion battery operated, and they sort of have that swap model, and so they
Right.
they structure that whole business model so that these guys don't have to pay for that retrofitting, but it's sort of added into the cost of operations.
Right. That is interesting. So that could be a very big market for it, because I mean
That
that
could be.
solves a lot of the problems of low income people with a e-rickshaw. Where do you leave it? How do I charge it? You go
Yeah.
to the battery swap. You swap your batteries. It's not that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and it also sort of tackles the problem of informal lead acid battery recycling, which is again a
Yeah.
big problem in parts of the country.
That actual sentence structure defines the problem. Informal lead acid battery recycling just
Exactly,
doesn't sound good.
exactly. I mean, yeah, it's so dangerous. It's got
Yeah.
such adverse health benefit, like health impacts on the people that are, engaged in it. It's just,
Yes.
yeah, but yet it continue, and it's like soil contamination, water contamination, and yet it continues to happen.
Right. I mean, I think the important thing is, I always want I can't help saying this. And I know it's a silly mantra, but it's very difficult to recycle gasoline or diesel. You can recycle batteries,
Yeah,
including lead. I mean, lead acid batteries you can recycle very effectively, but
exactly. But
in kind of the correct environment, not sort
yes,
of in someone's backyard with a
yeah,
hammer.
yeah,
So good.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, can we just briefly discuss the power generation, because that's the other stories that I see regularly is world's great biggest solar farm just opened in India. I mean, a huge. There's been it does sound like a really big growth in the installation of solar,
Yeah,
but I mean, still, I think you are. I mean, I know from spending time in Australia that there's a lot of ships full of coal that leave Australia going to India.
yeah,
That
yeah,
that is happening. But it, what I can't quite get my head around is for instance, in this country, the increase in demand for electricity is very small with the advent. We now have over 1 million electric vehicles, and there hasn't been this massive spike in demand because it's spreading it over the whole time. And we've had things like LED lights, which have
hmm,
reduced electricity use in this country by an enormous amount. So
hmm,
there hasn't been this big spike. But I'm guessing that in India, if you saw the graph of the increased use of electricity in India, it would be in an upward direction.
yeah, definitely. So
Right.
electricity consumption is definitely growing. Electricity demand, like travel demand, is growing quite quickly, and yeah, so it's a lot of um, contradictions to hold, but India is sort of doing everything simultaneously, I would say.
Right.
Um, so demand is growing because of course like energy access was actually not 100% until recently. I
Yeah.
think now official figures show that almost all parts of the country have been connected to the grid, although of course the reliability of that grid may not be of the same level throughout the country, and there may still be some rural hamlets and all that are still not very effectively connected. So
Right.
energy access was one thing that was sort of leading to demand because a lot of part of the country was just not connected and just didn't sort of have electricity demand.
Yeah.
On top of that, of course, growing incomes mean a growing number of appliances.
Yeah.
And growing heat means an incredible number of air conditioners
Air
being sold.
conditioning. Yeah.
Um, so all of this is, and of course, then industries being coming up and more manufacturing coming up. It is a growing economy. It is going to have growing electricity demand. At the same time, India has also committed to having, I think, 500 gigawatts of renewables by 2030 as part of their SDG commitments.
Wow. 500 gigawatts. That is just.
Yeah,
It's, wow. Yeah. That's a
um,
lot.
it is a lot, but our grid today is still primarily not renewables. I think renewables are maybe 10-12%. Again, I would have to be corrected on this, but I'm open to be corrected on this, but like I think they're about 10-12% max. Hydro and solar and everything combined. And a large part of our grid is sort of coal powered. And
Right.
India is also like taking a very pragmatic stance that as we ramp up renewables, we are going to need to continue to use coal because we are,
Yeah.
at that stage of development where we need to also ensure that, our quality of living rises, and
Yeah.
like because social growth, like socioeconomic growth, is just as important for us as environmental
Yeah.
sustainability.
Yeah.
And we're at that stage because currently India has one of the highest emissions, yes, but per capita emissions are far lower than global
Still low.
averages.
Way lower
So
than the
so
United States
exactly.
or.
Yeah. So
I mean, I think it's also worth pointing out that we quite happily burnt coal for 150 years in Europe without a second thought.
yeah.
We didn't mind, and then we went, "Oh, maybe we shouldn't." And now, so we really are in no position to tell anyone else what to do. I think it's very important to
Yeah. So I
remember.
mean, so yeah, that way. But then again, because of the intermittency of your renewables as well, the
Yeah,
country has also started this large battery electric storage systems drive,
right.
battery energy storage systems. So like your BESS systems again are now. Maybe that's only started in the last 3 4 years, I would say. But now there's a mission that is dedicated to actually increasing the setup of BESS plants so that they can start storing any excess renewable power and then sort of powering the grid later, which would sort of help. So the idea with the like again the main one of the main sort of pushbacks against EVs, both which is both a sincere question, but also sometimes used insidiously by like the people that are not in support of EV is, oh, the grid is dirty, so how does that, how is that useful? Like because you're kind of shipping your emissions elsewhere. But having said that, electric mobility is one of the pathways that I think the world is looking at globally.
Yeah,
And India, if it for economic purposes and for sort of ensuring that its climate commitments are met, needs to sort of ensure that they are on that from the beginning.
yeah,
And when I say for economic purposes, because India actually has like I think 20% of its vehicles are exported. So if their export markets are electrifying, they need to have that electric manufacturing, EV
right.
manufacturing capacity as well, right?
Yeah,
And at the same time, our grid is expected to sort of get cleaner gradually as well. And so those benefits will start kicking in. You can't really wait for the grid to be fully clean and then
no.
start moving to electric. And then, of course, your tailpipe emissions are removed, which is also a significant benefit.
I mean, I think it's always important that argument. I'm sure you're aware of this. I've heard for the last 15 years at least. Is just defines the fact that we are often ignorant of what energy use actually does. I mean, for example, I know that you import a huge amount of oil, of crude oil, which you refine in India.
Yeah,
Refining
yeah,
crude oil uses huge amounts,
yeah,
just
yeah,
city level
yeah,
amounts of electricity, and that's always ignored.
yeah,
You
yeah,
only ever measure what comes out of the tailpipe. Well, that's nothing.
yeah,
Wait till you
yeah,
see the ship that brought it to you, and all that. Anyway, that argument we've gone over many times. But it is, an electric e-rickshaw that is running on electricity that's only made from coal is still hugely cleaner than than a petrol-driven.
yeah, yeah.
Anyway, yeah,
Yeah.
very annoying that argument. That
Yeah, I mean,
argument is
I think we somehow like I know you've probably had this conversation a million times. I probably said it a million times, but like you still feel the need to reiterate it once in a while for every new context you come across because you're just like maybe they'll bring this up, so you kind of preface it
yeah.
with a disclaimer.
Um, uh, let me just check. Sorry,
But
I'm just going
energy
through my.
security, I mean, you were talking about crude oil and
Yes, well, I mean oil because it's 85% of your fuel is imported. So that implies there are oil wells in India that are extra, or within. Do you have some oil extraction in India? Because if you've got 85% of it's
yeah,
imported, where's the rest coming from?
yeah,
You
yeah,
don't
yeah.
need.
No, I think there is some. Again, I'm not sure about this, but I think there is some in like that was at least being there must be some and there was some being explored off coast in near Mumbai and everything, so I think there is some exploration as well still going on. But yeah, I think apart from the environmental transport decarbonization aspect, energy security has been another major driver for electric mobility, given like how crude prices have sort of just been, I mean, they've always been on a roller coaster, I guess, across decades. But yeah, I think just given the increasingly uncertain geopolitics of the global ecosystem, I think energy security is definitely becoming one of those aspects. Is one of the reasons that we're looking at electric mobility as well, and just like two and three wheelers, just the just two and three wheelers, I think, are responsible for like about 20% of oil consumption or something in the transport sector. So,
Right.
so
Wow.
just, removing those off the road could significantly reduce our transport oil demand.
Yeah.
And yeah, and like, so
Well, it
that's
is. I mean,
definitely a
I,
factor.
and I think that argument goes across the political spectrum, which is, I mean, I think it's very important that everyone. I mean, finally in this country, we now know that the cost of electricity and heating our homes went up, not because of renewables, not because of annoying wind turbines and solar panels, because of gas.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
was why it happened,
yeah,
and everyone understands that, and everyone accepts that's the reason. And I mean, that would affect the Indian economy as well, and it is also, when you buy coal from Australia, that money is leaving your economy and going to the Australian economy, even if it's not in
yeah,
total amounts. It's
yeah,
not that big a percentage. But the same for oil. And I mean, if you can make that in your own country,
yeah,
that does strike me as being a fairly, you know, very viable, sensible thing. It's employing
yeah.
people in your country, and that money is circulating within your own economy. I mean, it's not, it's not. I don't know. I'm not an economist.
Hmm.
I'm guessing, but but then so the cost of, say you're an e-rickshaw driver, and you no, because the e-rickshaw don't quite work. Let's go up one to the what were the one, what are they called, the ones that replace
Electric autos.
electric autos. So you're driving one of those, you're earning a living from it. Last week you were in a petrol one and you filled the tank. Is that per kilometer? Is it cheaper at
Much,
today's grid prices to run it on electricity?
much.
Right.
So I think it's about like one fifth the cost. And yeah, and it's the same for two wheelers as well. Like it's 1.5 rupees per kilometer if you look at the petrol cost and like you can go about 60 to 65 kilometers per 1 liter in
Right.
these two wheelers,
Yeah.
and so that's like that works out to about 1.5, 1.6 rupees per kilometer. And the same when you look at like electricity, electric vehicle, 3 kilowatt hour battery gives you a range of say about 100 kilometers on two
Right.
wheelers. And so there you have about zero point 0.3 rupees, because like I would say the cost of charging varies because it's a
Yeah.
state-led subject and different states have different EV tariffs and everything. But even if you assume like 10 rupees per unit of electricity, then that still works out to zero point 0.3 rupees per
Right.
kilometer, which is like,
Right.
yeah, about one fifth or even less.
Yeah.
And
Very.
so operationally, you can definitely see gains very quickly. And if you look at the total cost of ownership, and total cost of ownership is the cost of the vehicle when you purchase it and its operating cost over its lifetime, right?
Yeah.
Even if you consider, I think, a single battery replacement, which again, as battery technology improves and battery longevity increases, that may not even be required. Over a 10-year life cycle or something, for commercial vehicles, there is no question about it because they all run close to 100 kilometers a day. But even if you're like running about 30, 40 kilometers a day, it as a two-wheeler, like personal two-wheeler owner, it's completely viable.
Right.
And however, while today a lot of people don't necessarily drive their two-wheeler 30 kilometers a day, it's still very competitive. And I think more and more there are the two-wheeler companies are also introducing lower and lower cost two wheelers. So we do expect that like complete parity to be reached very soon. It's already been achieved for commercial operations, so commercial
So
use
in
cases.
initial purchase parity. So when you're buying a new vehicle, it will be the same as a petrol version. Is that what
No, I'm
you
saying
mean?
the total
Oh,
cost of ownership parity.
that's ownership. Okay. Yes. Sorry.
Initial
Yeah.
purchase parity, there is still some time to go. I mean, a little bit of time to go, I would say. What are the costs right now? So, like, an ICE two wheeler is about 75,000 rupees, which I think is
Yes. I haven't got my
900
calculator here.
nine
to do
hundred
that.
pounds, 90 pounds. No, nine. Sorry, let me do that.
Yeah.
I'd done all this as well because I knew that it
Right.
would
Well
come
done.
up. Um, yeah, like 680, 700 pounds is a
For
regular ice
for an
two
ICE
wheeler.
two wheeler, like a would be like a small scooter or a moped or a
No,
small
it is the entry,
motorbike.
like it's the entry cost of a motorcycle. So like a
Right.
100 cc, 120
Okay.
cc
Yeah.
motorcycle. Or like there are gearless scooters as well.
Right.
Like So a lot of scooters are about 125 cc. So those are your typical ones. Those are all around 75,000 rupees.
Right.
And so
Right. So
if you,
they're very cheap. Yes, they are by
yeah,
I mean, by our standards in Europe, very much
yeah,
cheaper.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm guessing, yeah, there's a difference in, I don't know, like purchasing power parity and all as
Yeah.
well. But,
And
but then if you,
an electric one then would be
an electric one then is about 33 to 66% more expensive. They start at 100,000 rupees, which is 900 pounds. And
right.
they can, like, a bunch of them are actually more close to 1,200 pounds, 1,300 pounds.
Yeah.
So definitely there is some time to go in achieving price parity at the time of purchase. But
Yeah.
if you have high utilization, it makes sense today economically.
Yes.
And a lot of people just also appreciate the fact that, they're not, their petrol prices, like their fuel costs are not high in general. Like I think I have a lot of friends who have purchased EVs, and they know that maybe if you look at it absolutely economically, it doesn't make sense, but in their daily running, they just have such low costs, and
Yeah.
maintenance costs are much lower and everything.
Yes.
So that way, I think if you're not buying it purely for economic reasons, it makes a lot of sense already.
Yeah.
And for commercial purposes, it makes competitive sense over the life of the vehicle, and
Yeah.
for any fleet operator or a personal vehicle owner. And then you have to come into financing, of course, because you have to ensure financing is affordable, and
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
they're like, initially financiers had higher interest rates for EVs. It's still the
Right.
case actually,
Yeah.
because because they're not sure about the technology, they're not sure about the second life value. Second life
Yeah.
value is also a major problem even today in India,
Right.
because
Because that's why I wanted to come on to that because we've got to wrap up fairly soon.
yeah,
Uh, um, that one of the big changes that we've seen here, literally this year, is the influx of a huge number of second-hand electric vehicles,
how
cars,
are they doing?
which which have sold really well, but they've driven the price down.
Mm,
The fact that there was a lot of them, it was mainly big corporate leasing companies. They didn't release one or two cars. They released, well, there's 200,000,
yeah, yeah,
huge number, and
yeah.
that meant that the price dropped.
Mm,
But from a point of view of a consumer, people are buying really good second-hand cars that we now know will last a long time. They're not
yeah,
going to fall to bits.
yeah.
And so I wondered if that same phenomena, maybe it hasn't happened yet in India, that, I mean, it's just from anecdotally. I never bought a new car. I didn't even know. I didn't even know people who bought new cars. None of my friends did, and it's only since electric cars have come out that I've had to consider the price of a new car, which is incredibly expensive.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
crazy. And I mean, is there a second-hand? Presumably, there has been a very healthy second-hand market for petrol two and three wheelers. So, will there then be a second-hand market for electric ones?
I There should be, but I think there's still some initial hiccups that need to be overcome.
Right.
One is the fact that because you've had a lot of new companies, you've also had a lot of really small new companies come
Yeah.
up in the two-wheeler and three-wheeler space. They don't have the after-sales service. They don't have the ability to refurbish vehicles and resell vehicles. So financiers are tacking on that cost onto the interest
Right.
rate, because
Yeah.
they're like, we don't know if this becomes a non-performing asset. We don't know whether we can even resell it after sort of, getting it.
3 years or
Um,
whatever.
so
Yeah.
so so that's one issue. The other thing is, I think understanding how batteries are going to do in the Indian context will become
Yeah.
important. There's two things, right? There's like the thermal aspect of operating at high temperatures, and
Yeah.
then there's also like your road. There's a lot more vibrations and all on Indian roads,
Right.
because their quality may be poorer, especially in smaller cities and everything. And so, how that will impact the life of the battery, and at the time of sale, what the remaining life on the battery is. How do you
Yeah.
determine that in an effective manner?
Yeah.
And so, like, and first generation batteries are also like seeing some issues of showing sudden SOC drops and everything. And I think
Right.
those are definitely getting figured out by the big OEMs. But
Yeah.
a combination of these factors is sort of saying, like, leading to the fact that there is no clarity on what the residual value is.
Right.
There are
Right.
not enough vehicles to actually determine that market yet.
Yeah.
And so, because of all of that, financing still remains a little more expensive for EVs. and
Right.
it is something that is expected to sort of sort itself out in the next couple of years. But
Yeah.
anything that can be done policy wise, or de-risking mechanisms wise, should be, and is something like organizations like ours and others are also looking at, as how do you accelerate that.
Yeah. 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 We've gone over an hour, which
Yeah.
is which was much too easy. With you are so brilliant. Thank you so much. This has been really. I'm all I'm going to do for the rest of today is think of questions that I forgot to ask you about things. But I mean, that was really wonderful. Thank you so much. And well, all power to you. And to the. I mean, I think the world genuinely has a lot to learn from India. Always has done historically, and should carry on doing it now. Because I mean, I think because you work through really big challenges, the huge population and enormous cities that have. I mean, I think that aspect is something we probably don't understand here. Is the number, you did mention it, the number of people who are leaving the countryside and going into cities. I mean, that happened here 150 years ago. So we've
Yeah,
kind of got
yeah,
we've got used. But now all that happens is people are leaving cities and moving back to the country, like I did.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that'll happen.
India's still only like 35-40% urban, I think, and India still only has like 35 cars per 1,000 people. This is
Yes.
compared to
Yeah.
like 800 or 900 in your, US,
Yeah. Yeah.
Germany, countries like that. So
Yeah.
just, yeah, a lot of its development indicators are very different. And so there's opportunities for leapfrogging, but there's also like massive scale challenges
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
get clean transitions in place.
It's been a real joy to talk to you, Chaitanya. Thank you so much today. That's been really fascinating, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.
Well, I really hope you enjoyed that. It was what an absolute joy to talk to Chaitanya. She's such a delight. That's all. Please do, as I said, give us a subscription. Tell your friends, and we look forward to seeing you again next week with another fabulous episode of the Fully Charged Show podcast. But until then, thank you for listening and watching, if you have been.